I'm very excited today because I am interviewing Christopher Norton. Now, I've known and played many of Christopher Norton's pieces and taught a lot of his pieces since the very early 90s. So welcome, Chris. How are you?
I'm really good.
And where are you at the moment?
I'm in Canada, where I live now, and in fact, I'm looking out of my window, and it's snow. There's even more snow forecast for the next couple of days. So we're in the middle of a Canadian winter here. It's Ontario, so it's not as bad as it gets in Canada, and it certainly is nothing to compare with what Australia's gone through in terms of going the other way.
Yes. Well, we've certainly got the heat at the moment.
Yeah.
So, Chris, tell me about, I mean, you've been composing for a very long time, and we've both been in the music teaching industry for a very long time. How did you get started with composing and playing and what have you?
I was really keen on classical piano from a very early stage, and on classical music indeed. But I also play by ear. My father being a minister, I got to play for meetings and all that. So I wasn't through a jazz background. It was more, you might call it, a gospel background.
Mm-hmm.
But I fiddled about on the piano, but it was only when I was 14, quite late for some reason, that I suddenly one summer holiday decided I'd like to try and write something of my own. And I think it was just a solo piano piece. And then gradually did all sorts of things. But I was fortunate that at the time in New Zealand, there was a teacher who was working for the university extension department, I think they called it, whose name was Rosemary Miller. And she's become a very well-regarded teacher and an associated board examiner and so on in New Zealand. In fact, I think she just got the Order of Merit or whatever the equivalent is for New Zealand. So she's a well-known figure, but she wanted to start composition classes for teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
And I was one of them. And so she just struck me at the right moment. I think it's an important thing to say that sometimes students might be interested in writing, but they sometimes need someone to say, have you ever thought of writing?
That's too true.
As simple as that. And so I began trying to write stuff and quite quickly wrote bigger pieces. And then eventually when I was 16, I think I wrote a piece for orchestra. In other words, it happened quite quickly. But I had a huge listening background preceding that. So in a way, what I wrote was particularly influenced by things I liked. And my favorite composer at the time was French. So Ravel and Debussy were probably starting points. And also Nielsen, I was mad keen on, the Danish composer, and Prokofiev. And I think all those kind of milled around and ended up being contributors to what became me.
That's such an interesting story. When did you start writing for children?
I probably started writing for children when I became a school teacher, because after I finished my first degree in New Zealand, I moved to Wellington because my then wife was training to be a librarian, and I just needed to get a job. And that was the good old days. That was the good old days where I went into the government department to do with teaching jobs and said, I've got a first-class honours degree in music. I'm interested in a music teaching job at a school. And they said, well, here's a list, take your pick.
Oh, wow.
There's no question of going through teacher training or anything. I just started, basically. And I was 19 years old. As soon as I got there, of course, I discovered it was a whole other world, that the students had no interest in Debussy, Ravel, and Nielsen, and were only interested in heavy metal, heavy rock, and on the other side of the coin, R&B and soul and so on. But it coincided with me starting to get interested because I'd been introduced to a lot of pop music for the first time by a New Zealand guy called George Kay, he's ended up head of history at Otago Boys High School. But he was also a rock critic. He interviewed all the big names that came through, and he had a really good nose for what was good, if you like. So he said, you just have to listen to the right stuff. Because I said, I don't think it's as good as classical music. And he said, well, you just need to listen to stuff other than what you've heard so far. So I got quite a good education in listening and went to see bands and all that. And at the same time as I got a school teaching job, I was asked to join a band for the first time and was thrown into transcription and playing keyboards and all that. and discovered I really liked it. So gradually that became something alongside the classical music interest, which didn't wane. I was still doing concerto playing and so on. And so I ended up with a kind of poised between two worlds, if you like, which is where microjazz came from.
So really, that connection between that classical and contemporary seems to be a very common thing with people who are doing composition and also successful performers as well.
Yeah.
So tell me about the first microjazz. Was that the first piece, the first book that you did?
No, I mean, I wrote lots of pieces in New Zealand which were kind of like microjazz. In other words, I was trying to combine the sound of popular music with the notation of classical music, which is really what microjazz is.
Mm-hmm.
And then I came to the UK on a scholarship in 1977, and quite quickly was sort of talent spotted by a very famous music educator of the time called John Painter, who was
Mm-hmm.
one of the lecturers at York University, and he introduced me to his publisher, and they were called Universal Edition, which they're still going. Obviously, they produce. I mean, their big name is the Carmina Burana guy, you know,
Carl Orff.
Karl Orff, but also Stockhausen, Schoenberg, and so on. They have sort of an eclectic range of stuff still, but Universal Edition, I got to know their education manager, and he asked me to do the very first publication I had in the UK, which was a book of piano duet arrangements of Christmas carols. Just straight
Wow.
ahead arrangement. They're still available. But shortly after that, he said, "I've got an interesting idea. Would you like to try and write us some improvisations on Christmas carols?" And it became a book called Carol Jazz, which you may have come across,
I haven't, but
which
I
is
will
still
look out for that one.
it's a very popular book. It's probably about grades 6 to 8. They're quite difficult, but they're still really quirky, and totally characteristic of what I do. And then I did another piece for choir and piano and percussion. And then I met Boozy and Hawkes, because somebody I'd taught the piano at York University became an assistant to the chief of head of music publishing at Boozy and Hawkes. And they asked to meet me. And of course, I had sales figures and books already out with another publisher. But just before I saw them, I was asked by their education guy to do something very interesting. He said, "I'd like you to write me a set of graded pieces in popular styles, not Christmas, but just pieces." And I wrote about 40 pieces in a bunch, and it became Microjazz 1 and 2. But he left the company at that point and emigrated to Canada. And so I had these pieces sitting in my bottom drawer for probably 2 years, what became Microjazz. And I happened to strike somebody at Boozy and Hawkes who totally got them and thought, and in fact, he invented the name because they were also the publishers of Microcosmos. So they were trying to sort of draw a parallel between the Bartok easy pieces and these popular pieces. So that's where the name came from. But they were taken up by the Associated Board within 2 years, 2 of the pieces, it's grade 3 and 4, and they suddenly went like wildfire. And
Yes,
in
I
fact,
know.
they've sold ever since. And then were taken up by the AMEB big time. And
Yes.
so I just struck it lucky at every turn, because it is partly luck, isn't it, as well as goodness.
It certainly
Yeah.
is.
And I
I
just happened to
remember.
meet the right people at the right time, because if you meet the wrong people, like record companies are full of this, where bands don't strike a deal, the Beatles being a famous one, and then somebody else signs them up and they become popular. So you've got to hit the right person in the A&R department.
Exactly.
You were going to say?
I was going to say, I know you've had backing tracks. I remember back when I first met you, and you just put out your first sort of backing tracks. I'm not sure whether they're from Microjazz or which particular series, but you brought them out on, I think, on MT disc for the Roland sound.
Oh, it was Roland, yes. Roland happened to be doing a lot of MIDI files at the time, and I teamed up with a very good MIDI programmer who I still work with, and we ended up doing track. And the pieces suited accompaniment tracks very well, because Microjazz is quite linear, In other words, it's not like it's full of big chords, and so there's plenty of space for bass and drums and guitars parts to fit, if you like. So, and a lot of rootless voicings as well, which I just like the sound of them, not realizing that was a kind of characteristic thing of a lot of jazz and pop players to do. And so when you put bass and drums with them, they just sounded like hand and glove.
They do. And did you ever think about the benefits for the student, or did you think, oh, that just sounds good?
No, I realized quite quickly the benefits for the student. Partly that you're for the time playing aspect, obviously, but one of the big things I think is also I discovered when I played with live players that it makes you play different. It makes you think of things you didn't know you knew. And I think if you've got good MIDI tracks, they are played by live players. And effectively, my tracks were played by this particular guy. Did a lot of work with me, and he tended to play the drums in one take without quantizing. You know, I mean, in other words, they felt like somebody really playing. It wasn't just copying up 4 bars and then 4 bars and so on. So I think they had a sort of organic feel to them, if you like. So when you play with them, you got that experience somewhat of what it's like to play with a good bass player and a good drummer and a good guitarist. And so students loved that. And of course, you could also slow them down so that you didn't have to play them at the sometimes rather brisk tempos I wrote them at.
Yes.
And you could also practice left hand with the right hand, playing from sequence and so on. So it just meant there are lots of fun things. But what my main point is, I think that when you play with tracks, you're learning all sorts of things about styles.
Yes.
Which are very rich in content. It's not really just about timekeeping. Otherwise, you might as well do it with a metronome. It's the idea of hearing these other sounds while you're playing, if you like, and hearing these other parts.
I love the experience of getting the genre and style of a piece from a backing track. And that I think gives children a real opportunity to have some understanding, but also maybe harmonic understanding as well, because they might be playing 1 or 2 lines, but they don't understand or they don't hear that it might be, an A7 chord, but they're only playing an A and an E, but there's a beautiful 7th in there as well to add color and flavor. So lots of
exactly. One thing which I still do, actually, because I do a lot of work with children still on chord playing and improvisation, was I take a piece and just do chords with it, play chords with the backing track, and they love doing that. And of course, you can teach inverted chords quite quickly because they're easy to play, but because they're a mysterious thing to try and explain. If you've got a chord G, C sharp, E, and you say that's an A7 chord 3rd inversion, it's too much information, but they can play it. And then you say, we're going to go from that. Well, I've got that on. Can you hear? I'll just turn the sort of piano up here. Hang on a minute. I'm trying to remember how the volume control. Oh, yeah, here it is. Can you hear that?
Yep.
And then you say to them, no, we're going to change from that to F sharp D, C, D. So it's right next to it. So it's an easy transition. But if you've got a chord with A7, D7, and then you've got a backing track in a particular style, it's a really nice thing to do. And of course, when you then try and do simple right-hand improvisation with that chord shape playing, you're starting to sound like the real thing almost immediately. And then you can play them something of the real thing, like some wonderful jazz player who's using those particular types of voicings, but using nice rhythms of the left hand. You say, well, this is kind of what we're doing already. You can hear how nice it sounds when you practice it a bit and get it fluent, if you like.
Yes, I think the opportunity to hear often with pianists, piano teachers, when we teach chords, many people are teaching that sort of
exactly.
And whereas when you're hearing it with that sort of or correct 16th century harmony, but well-voiced harmony, make
Yeah.
such a difference for the oral understanding.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I think that's one of the big things I discovered. There's a microjazz is full of, and so is connections, so is American. All the stuff I do is full of chord shapes, which are inversions, which are easier to play, but close together. The voice leading's nice, but you're then playing nice tunes above them because I'm a tune writer, if you like.
Mm.
Then you add the bass and drums to it, and you've got a whole nice experience over and over, if you like, in a whole range of styles.
I did when I was back in the 90s. That the Australian Music Examinations brought out a series of exams called Contemporary Popular Music, and
Yeah.
I hadn't done the exams, but I had students doing the exams. So I thought, I'll just put myself through the equivalent of a grade 8 one, and I think I was
Yeah.
playing one of your rock preludes for it.
Yeah, and they're not easy.
They're not easy, but so pianistic. I remember they just fall under the fingers. They're not easy to play, but they are very pianistic, because often
Yeah.
you're playing, when you play contemporary music or contemporary pop or rock music, they're often arrangements, and they're not particularly, often they're not written by someone who's experienced from a pianistic pedagogy level,
Yeah.
whereas I've found that all of your material is very much based around fingering patterns that are easy or logical.
Yeah. And I do finger when there's a position change. So
Yes.
there's lots of signposts for the fact that you're perhaps going to have to move out of position. Sometimes there's a lot of position changing, but that's just the way it is. If you're doing a ragtime piece, you're going to have to move position.
Yes. So tell me about Connections. You're bringing out a new book called Connections Proprietary.
Well, yeah, this is a sort of interesting coming together of a whole lot of different worlds, because I'm good friends with the Royal Conservatory in Canada, which is a big organization. I mean, there's 104,000 students, I think, in Canada do Royal Conservatory exams. Also with Conservatory Canada, also with the Canadian National Conservatory of Music. So there are 3 different examination boards, also AMEB, ANSCA, etc. In other words, I know lots of examination boards, and Connections has been out since 2007. In fact, I've expanded it very recently and done Connections 9 and 10, which are basically around about grade 8. But I'm also good friends with Music for Young Children. You may have come across
Yes, I
them
do
at the
know
recent
that.
conference in Melbourne. But they asked me to do a book on improvisation for their students, and these are all little 8 and 9-year-olds who do everything in groups. So I've written a book, but what I did was I wrote a whole of new pieces, and I'm putting them in as part of the Connections series, so that they're going to be a new book called Connections Preparatory. So it'll be actually one underneath Connections 1, which is rather nice. But this NYC thing is a way of flagging up those pieces so that children can actually hear the pieces. In fact, I've got it in front of me here. I could give you a sneak preview if you like.
Oh, do, please.
Very straightforward, but the first piece up is called Cross Country Skiing.
Right.
It sounds like this. So that's easier than anything in Connections 1, and it's all no harder than the pieces they're already playing in their what's called Moomies and Sunbeams books, which are, again, for these 8 and 9-year-olds, probably pre-grade 1, if you like. But
Well,
that's got a whole lovely track we go, and MIDI file. I'm still doing MIDI files because NYC have kind of, they got in with Roland quite a long time ago, and so they're still using MT32s. And in other words, they've got a lot of the old gear, So I figure, well, I'll do everything so that it actually doesn't suddenly say you can't use what the gear you've already got. So they've got backing tracks and audio, but they've also got backing tracks in MIDI, which is lovely.
So that one was called Cross Country Skiing.
Yeah, and that's the first piece in this new NYC book, which has been launched in July. So
and
this
will
is
it be
new.
available to the open market?
Yes, it will.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's also going to be available on something called SuperScore, which you may have
Right.
come across. So
I
we'll put it
have.
onto the iPad platform as well, because I'm good friends
Fantastic.
with the SuperScore people, and in fact, I've got a lot of my stuff on that as well. Because continuing that process, that they use MIDI files still. So I'm quite interested in seeing there's a company that is actually trying to use the power of MIDI, if you like. I mean, it never sounds as good as audio, but heck, with MP3 files floating around the universe at the moment, nothing sounds that great. You know, in a sense, it sounds. And when it's played through a digital piano, they do sound nice. The tracks sound great. You know. So.
Yes, exactly. That's perfect for a Canadian environment. Cross country skiing. Maybe you might need to turn it into a surfing song for Australia.
Exactly. Well, in fact, I think, and let's have a look. There's something called tribal dance, which is perhaps getting a little bit closer to Australia.
Well,
and
maybe
Blue Horizon. So I mean, I just happen to have started with one which has got a skiing thing, but that's not really a Canadian thing. I think it just felt like a good title for that little piece.
And what have you got for the British?
For the British, let's have a look. Oh yeah, there's the third track is called "I've Changed My Mind." So yeah, it's a Brexit piece. Basically.
Brexit piece.
Yeah.
So I can see you're doing a lot of work in Canada. So you've got a British Columbia tour coming up, Yamaha Music Camp in Whistler. That sounds amazing. And the Summer Sizzle Music Camp in Canada. So what do you do at these music camps?
I largely do a mixture of masterclasses and groups of kids doing improvisation and chord playing. So because there's nobody else does it quite the same way. So they like the fact that I've got this particular angle on doing that. Funny enough, I'm giving a teacher presentation shortly, and I've called it From Strutting to Sonatas.
Strutting is one of your very famous and well-known pieces, I think.
That's right.
And
oops, you got me going. But the sonatas, of course, refers to the fact that I've got a jazz piano sonata out, which is getting quite a lot of performances and masterclasses as well. And that's right at the other end. So I've actually gone right from strutting all the way through to doing things which are like concert works. In fact, that was written very sadly for Giovanni Re de Pedro, who you probably knew. Did you know him? Who toured Australia a number of times, Sydney, and he actually commissioned a second sonata, which another pianist in North America is premiering shortly. But that was a very sad loss. Yeah,
terrible. So, Chris, you've given us an audio file. Tell me about that.
Yes, we've talked about backing tracks, and I particularly like this one. This is a backing track for a piece in Connections 9 called "Tearaway." It's like a really up-tempo 16th note disco-y kind of thing. And the guy who I've worked with all these years of MIDI files and backing tracks has done this for me. And it's really amazing. The piece is called Tearaway, and it's, again, just on the piano.
I listened to it and I thought it was a really great track.
Yeah. So the track and the piano combination is wonderful, and that's available on SuperScore as well. So people can learn it from that.
And it's from Connections number 9.
Connections 9, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you at MTNA.
Yeah, great. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Chris. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.